The experience of feeling left out is a very personal experience. You know, what is it about me that is not okay for this environment or experience? Why don't I get to be part of it?
This is about recognising that all participation is worthy. And if we think that all participation is worthy, then we have that mindset where we are moving towards more inclusive design.
If it were just a case of people wanting to do the right thing and be inclusive and have good intentions, then all of our learning experiences would already be that way. So it's not enough to have the desire or even really the knowledge. You have to be able to apply it. So I think that's how we knew from the beginning that there was greater need for some practical tools to do this.
Hi, and welcome back to Adventures in Learning Design, a place to talk about how to design effective learning experiences. My name's Laurie Harrison.
And my name's Tim Gifford.
And we're both co-founders of LearnJam, a learning agency and consultancy. Episode 12, Inclusive Learning Design. As we all know, the move to online learning has been massively accelerated by the COVID crisis over the last year. One of the negative consequences of that has been the fact that a large number of learners or potential learners are being excluded from online learning experiences. At LearnJam, we've been working on a government-funded project to explore this problem and to develop a framework and some tools to help people who are developing online courses to do something about it. Two of the people leading on this project are Lucy Williams and Laura Patsko, who you've heard before on the podcast. Tim and I spoke to Lucy and Laura to get their take on the project and the work that we've all been doing on this, and to explore together this whole issue of exclusion and what it means to move towards more inclusive online learning.
Well, a warm welcome to Lucy Williams and Laura Patsko, who are joining us this fine morning to talk about a special project that we started last year. Hi, Laura. Hi, Lucy. How are you both?
Hi, Tim. I'm good. This is Laura. Nice to see you this morning.
Great to see you too. And hey, Lucy, your first time on the podcast. Welcome.
Hey.
I know, yeah. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here on this cold day.
Trying to get you on this podcast for months, Lucy, but you've finally done it.
It's great to hear your voice over the airwaves. So we're here to talk about a project that we started last year and that, Lucy, you are project lead on. And it's been a really fascinating project for us so far, and I think a worthy of a conversation, an exploration, and hopefully not just this one, hopefully a series of them. But to give a bit of context to it, so last year we started working on a project that was funded by Innovate UK, which aims to address inequalities in inclusivity and access in learning design that have been brought to the forefront as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Quite a challenge, but one that we felt we really wanted to respond to. Lucy, could you kind of talk us through how we responded to that call, I suppose, from Innovate UK to help address some of the challenges that have resulted from COVID-19 over the last year or so?
Yeah, so I think we recognised that the pandemic has had a massive impact on education in general, and it's really accelerated the trend towards online learning that was already there. It's forced most learning activities to either go online or stop completely, and there's been a big rush to do that, understandably, and that there were already lots of issues that existed with lots of people being excluded from online experiences, and that we felt that this rush and acceleration to bringing everything online in the last year has made that worse. It's exacerbated the exclusion issues that already existed, and I think we came at this project thinking, what is our responsibility as learning designers in this, and how can we address that? How can we help remove barriers to online learning so that all learners can participate. So that's kind of the drive, I think, from our point of view for taking on this project.
So we moved on to talk about what those barriers are. What are all the different ways that people are being excluded from online learning? Part of the impetus for us in getting into this project, there was a lot of publicity, I guess last summer really, in response to this mass move to online learning about people being excluded. A lot of it was around the formal education sector, for example, kids not being able to access online classes because they don't have laptops, real basic access problems. And I think that's kind of what sparked a thought for us. But there's other issues as well. And I think as we've kind of got into this, we've discovered that there are all sorts of ways that people are being excluded from online learning. And if online learning is a big part of the new normal, then it's really important that that's understood better and addressed. What are some of the ways that we've become aware of, or that we're already aware of, that people are being excluded, other than I don't have a laptop?
I mean, like you say, there's so many aspects to inclusion or exclusion. And I think for me, one of the most powerful things I read was about, I think it was Kat Holmes, who said, if you ask people, to define what inclusion means, you'll get lots of different definitions. But if you ask them to define exclusion, everybody has a common experience. It's being left out. And that feeling of being left out can take so many forms that the sort of crudest, most obvious, which I think many people were already aware of, but became really sort of general public knowledge when COVID-19 forced so much formal education online, like school-age children, for example. The most obvious manifestation of that feeling left out was when people simply couldn't get into their online lessons because they, like you say, they didn't have a laptop, or maybe there's a family with several children and they have a household computer. If they're lucky, even having one computer in the household is a marker of certain socioeconomic privilege. And so there were questions raised about digital access and the digital divide. And that was, like I say, the kind of crudest, most obvious, well, if you need to learn online and you can't get online, you're excluded. But there's all sorts of other elements of being left out, some of which are issues of representation, like being able to see yourself or people like you in the learning material, which is not specific to online learning. That's true of any learning content, really. There are issues which are not, let's say, permanent states, but might be temporary. So we've probably all had the feeling of being left out, let's say, to a greater or lesser degree of psychological distress. But if you're sick one day and you miss a class or you miss a meeting, but you've still been left out of that class. So there are situational factors as well, things that occur temporarily or at short notice, which result in you needing to catch up, or maybe not catch up. Maybe you just never catch up on what you've missed. So there's all these different dimensions. There's also accessibility issues, which again is not specific to online learning, but I think was seen a lot more because the nature of the spread of the pandemic was so sudden and so dramatic that organizations who were providing excellent educational opportunities for children or adults or anybody needing to learn, but not traditionally online, suddenly found that they had to put it all online, and they just weren't ready. There wasn't training in place. There weren't systems. It takes time. I think I heard in an interview with somebody from the Open University once in the UK that it can take years for them to develop a quality distance course. And they've been doing that for decades before the internet was even a thing. So if you consider that online learning can work really well when the people designing it have had the time and the resources to design the content and train the teachers and the learners to train them how to learn online. Well, asking people to do all that in the space of a few weeks put massive pressure on people. And that, again, resulted in exclusion because it meant that, let's say, a material that would have been accessible to somebody on paper is now on screen. And, let's imagine a learner who, for some reason, has difficulty processing text on screen, or maybe they need to use a screen reader, but the platform that the content was put into can't be integrated with the screen reader. Or maybe there's audio content in the course and the learner doesn't have a good pair of headphones, and so they can't really participate in the course just because there wasn't enough time to develop the material in as sophisticated a way as as necessary. So all that big mess of it, I mean, and there's so many more. There's so many more issues.
And a lot of those issues aren't things that a learning designer could solve. As you start to dig into this, there's so much. And I guess for us, when we sort of decided to go for this project, we're not in a position to solve the problem of, I don't have a laptop. So the question really was, what can we as learning designers do to help with this?
Absolutely.
And what might that look like?
And I think part of, before action generally comes awareness, ideally, rather than sort of just acting blindly. And that level of awareness is critical, because even if as a learning designer, I'm not able to buy a laptop for every learner who is going to use the design, I still need to know whether their access to one is going to affect their experience. Because it doesn't matter how amazing a learning opportunity is if the person can't get to it. And I might need to think more creatively about how their work is assessed, deadlines, flexibility in terms of when you access the course and so on. So even though there's certain things that are kind of outside our power to change immediately, it's absolutely within our power and our responsibility to be aware of them and be aware of the systems that we're operating within. So it's a very complex picture, definitely.
Yeah, we knew it was going to be complex, but I think we've we've learned that it's
there's so
more
much
complex
learning.
than we imagined.
I was going to say, it can lead us to really pushing our thinking as learning designers as well. So thinking about one of the big effects of the pandemic, I think for everyone, has been an increased social isolation, lack of human contact, that kind of thing. So we can ask ourselves as learning designers, how might we build a sense of belonging and connection into our online learning experiences? This is a real opportunity for the learning design community to ask those questions and to push ourselves to think bigger, think better about learning experiences that we design.
An interesting thought there, isn't there, that COVID-19 crisis has pushed online learning over the chasm and kind of normalised it and made it, mass adoption has happened. But can we use this as an opportunity, not just to take what we were doing before and make that available to loads more people because it's now normalised, but what can we do, what can we learn, and then what can we do with that learning to actually take it to the next level? And I think it's a really interesting point about using it to build connection and community and so on, and as maybe there's the missing piece of a lot of online learning up until now. So I think there's a really interesting opportunity there as well, and that in my Twitter scrolling and so on, in terms of sort of online learning, which is what I tend to follow, that's becoming a much bigger, hotter topic. There's a lot of discussion around that, around connection and community as an integral part of online learning. We digress slightly from inclusivity, but I think it's a key part of that still.
Well, I think that's been one of our key findings. It's so easy to digress because in effect, it's not digression because everything is so interconnected. That as soon as you accept that a learner is a whole person, it's not just about taking a course, but it's about their learning environment, it's about the tools they're using, it's about the stability of their access to those tools, it's about the support they get from their community. Every conversation is a digression, if that can be said, because it's all connected, right? It's all connected,
At this point, we thought it would be good just to back up briefly and give a bit of background on the Innovate UK project that we're doing. Over to Lucy.
Went into this project thinking that we could create a toolkit, or basically a set of tools to help learning designers and learning providers build digital learning products that are more inclusive. And I think we saw that as being that we'd research and develop some kind of framework for what inclusive learning design looks like. What are the principles behind inclusive learning design, and what does good look like in terms of inclusive learning design? And then create a toolkit that sits around that framework to help us and other learning designers put that into practice. So how can we make it practical? What does it mean that you need to do as a learning designer every day, informed by this inclusive learning design framework and principles, what does it mean that you need to do every day to move the work that you do and how you do it towards more inclusive learning design? So we split the project down into 3 phases. So research phase, where I think as Laura's already said, we wanted to really explore the space. What does inclusive learning design look like? We didn't start this project with a really clear idea of what that looked like. We needed to find out ourselves. So exploring the problem space and defining our project goals, really, and then moving into concept development. So informed by our research, developing the idea for this toolkit. What's in the toolkit? What does it need to do? Who does it need to do it for? And then to prototype and test that, iterate on it, and then move into an MVP stage where we're actually building something, working with organisations and learning designers to test that and improve it.
That's the question I wanted to get into, which is, as we've talked about, we saw this, the need on our side to learn about this space, about the challenges with inclusive learning ourselves. And it's, as you were saying, Laura, a really complex, multifaceted, far-ranging topic. There's so much involved in this. How did we go about kind of going into how did we approach the research phase going into this? Like, given the complexity, the breadth, how did we kind of approach the reading, research, information gathering that helped us shape our thinking around this project?
That is a very good question, and it's hard to answer succinctly because the approach was quite emergent. I think that's a good thing, actually. I think it's quite healthy for research approaches to be quite emergent in nature, because then, by definition, when you research things, you learn new things and you change your thinking. And so if you just bulldoze through with your original approach or objectives without taking into account what you've learned along the way, then I don't think you necessarily grow as much. And that's what we realized very early on, was this was about us all growing as a team and an organization. So the way we approached it, I think at the beginning, we started with some kind of exercises in recognizing where our existing expertise lies and our strengths. And we combined that with how our knowledge, our expertise has developed through other projects that we've done. So things that we've learned through working on other projects, new questions that have emerged that maybe we wouldn't have asked some years ago. And we also began to grow our network of people that we work with, and for them to connect us with other people in their network, so that we ended up with quite a big range of insights and views to bring into the project that we might not normally have on a project team, which has made it incredibly complex. Like, how do you get all of those people working together in a smooth way and pooling their knowledge? So the research sort of took quite a dynamic format involving a lot more players, which again, I think is quite reflective of the nature and the purposes of this project, is that we realized the importance of having voices in the conversation from the beginning. And this is where inclusivity projects, I think, often have a big risk, a big red flag is, with the best of intentions, a team of people will do a lot of work on something inclusive, get really, really far, and then put it in front of an expert in inclusion or diversity or what have you, and say, what do you think? And then it's kind of late to really make any changes because the ideas have developed really, really far. Maybe your project has a deadline and so on. So when we were setting up the research for this project, we said right at the beginning, let's start with more questions than answers, and let's ask more people than we've ever asked before. And let's start those conversations now and really have the whole project take shape around that diverse range of insights. So we were working with subject matter experts. We were reading literature. We were, by literature, I mean sort of existing research on inclusivity and education. And we were sort of allowing those things to build each other. So, for example, we would contact people who had written the research papers that we'd read, and the people we were talking to personally would then recommend other things to read and so on. So all of that knowledge was building and building and building, which is probably why quite quickly we felt so overwhelmed by the complexity of the space. Yeah. But yeah, it was quite exciting to work that way. And I think I hope we would have realized this anyway, but I think that's an important outtake from that process, is that the more voices you have in a conversation, the richer the development of that conversation, even though it can feel quite messy and busy and there's so much to learn and so much I don't know. Yeah. But that's hugely valuable. Yeah. Hugely valuable.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Like embracing the complexity of what we're trying to do rather than trying to simplify that complexity.
One of the goals of the project is to create a toolkit for inclusive learning design. But what do we really mean by a toolkit, and what should it be based on?
So I think what I have found really exciting about this project is that from the outset, we kind of knew instinctively, like, there's a toolkit here that's needed. Like, we don't know what it is. We don't know what's included in it. We don't know necessarily how it's going to work, but we know that there's a set of tools that needs to be brought into being that helps learning providers and learning designers like us, like, make more inclusive learning experiences. So I guess, like, since we started that with this sort of like instinctive, foggy view of like, okay, there's a toolkit somewhere. Since we started that in December, how has our thinking around that coalesced or clarified? How are we now seeing that toolkit? How are we now visualizing that after the research and discussions that have taken place over the last few months?
Even with the foggy idea of a toolkit in mind, there's got to be some kind of knowledge base that underpins tools. I think to someone kind of hearing this, they might feel like, how can you know from the beginning that there's tools required? But I think that just reflects the fact that learning designers, and particularly learning designers like us who all have a background as teachers, are very practical in mindset. And in the process of working out what's required, we realized first you have to map out the knowledge base underlying that. You have to somehow conceptualize, or not conceptualize actually, because that's too abstract, but to represent your conceptualization, to represent the complex interplay of the many factors that can make a learning experience inclusive or not. Where the risks lie and where potential barriers arise, and what happens if a learner has multiple barriers in the way of accessing a learning experience. So before we got into the detail of creating specific tools, we had to first understand the job at hand. And to do that, we started kind of thinking, what actually are the different dimensions of an effective learning experience? What are the main factors? Where are the major sort of spheres of influence in learning design? Mm-hmm. And we distilled this down to 4 broad areas: the kind of the who, the where, the what, and the how. So the who being the learners themselves. What is it about a learner that can make an experience more or less inclusive? Then the environment. What is it about the environment that can make an experience more or less inclusive? Then the actual content. So what is being learned, the focus of learning, and the tasks, let's say. And then the methods or modes that are used. And on each of those dimensions, there are points along the way where potentially included learners could be excluded. There are points where barriers can arise. And in order to create tools to remove or avoid those barriers, we need to first know what they are and how it is that they arise and how the different parts intersect. So that's how we started to imagine this underlying knowledge base, these 4 different dimensions of ILXD, or inclusive learning design. And on top of that, we realized that these can operate at all different levels. So you can have the very micro level, what is it that's inherent to the learning experience or the learner itself? Does this person have for example, a motor disability that affects their use of a particular tool that is absolutely required because of the way that learning experience is designed. So very, very micro, really baked into the whole thing. Then you have the sort of higher macro level. So what is it that's maybe not baked into the learner or the experience itself, but will obviously have an impact? So earlier, for example, we were talking about digital access. You know, if an online course is available and it's an amazing online course and the learner is absolutely motivated and able to use it, but doesn't have an internet connection, then even though that internet connection itself isn't like part of the design, it nevertheless affects their access. And then transcending all of that is this kind of meta level. So the super high level, and this comes back to what we were saying earlier about imagining the learner as a whole person. So these are things that might not immediately seem like anything to do with the learning experience, but will inevitably have an effect. And they could be things like we said before, like kind of temporary states. So, I don't know, the learner is extremely tired one day for some reason. Well, that's, you know, that's just what happens because we're human and some days we have hard days. But there's no getting around the fact that that might affect their motivation that day, their ability to focus, their ability to use the technology if it's a digital tool and so on. Or it could be things like the local political environment. You know, if there's instability in the region which has affected a learner's access to education, either because they can't travel outside their home or because their education's been interrupted by civil war or, you know, these things that you wouldn't really normally talk about in conversations about learning experience design, but they still affect the learner at some level and in one of those 4 dimensions. So we kind of, and this is why, you know, the development of a toolkit takes so long, is because you don't just sort of say, let's make a tool. It's not that simple. First, you have to evaluate what it is that you know and what you don't know and work out where the gaps are, fill them. And as we said before, talk to a lot of different people, because there's always a risk in any job, I think, not just learning design. There's always a risk that we'll sort of do our jobs in the way that we do things, you know, based on our individual experience and preferences and biases and styles and so on. So it's really important that we're not representing the knowledge base of a couple of certainly interested and competent individuals. That, you know, it's not, there's so much more knowledge out there in the world and so much more experience. So it's quite a complicated process.
There's a kind of an interesting aspect there as well, which is, I guess, the lack of diversity within us as a group.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Which I think, you know, that's something that sort of struck us very early on in this project, isn't it? And hence the real critical need to engage with a wide variety of different people and get different voices involved in this process and
absolutely
helping us to guide it and you know, push us outside our comfort zones, push us in new directions, teach us things we didn't know or just weren't aware of before. That are a really important part of this.
And I think that use of words is really important. You know, teach us things we didn't know. It's not about what we couldn't know. You know, there's a responsibility on all of us to educate ourselves about the experiences of others, because you will only live your own life, but we're all part of a community. And if we're really trying to design for people, we have to understand people. And people come from all different backgrounds, they have all different needs, and there's an intersectionality of needs that can affect their experience as well. So, yeah, it's okay to say, I don't know that yet, you know, but you find out, you know, do the work, talk to people, ask good questions, and listen to the answers. You know, don't go into things with a very solid idea that, I get it, I know about all that. There has to be a kind of empathy and openness in this process. And again, that takes time, and it's time well spent.
I remember a really early conversation was, you know, we really wanted to be careful that we didn't go about this project in a way that kind of indicated that we had cracked it. That we were like, it's all right, we've done it, you're welcome. I think we've cracked the whole inclusivity thing. That we wanted to make sure that we were exposing our own sort of inadequacies, ignorance, biases, and not just exposing them to ourselves, but kind of showing that in our working as well, right? And so, I think it's been an important sort of mindset that we've had to occupy, is like we're working through this. We know something valuable needs to come out of this, but like we're not claiming that we've got the solution already baked yet, or that we necessarily own that solution. It's kind of an accumulation of things, right?
Yeah, I think we definitely set out with that mindset that we knew we'd need to dig deep and take a long, hard look at ourselves in this project. But I think even we didn't realise like what that would mean for the project and for LearnJam as an organisation, and that we have realised that we can't simply develop a tool or toolkit to make learning design more inclusive. We also need to really work on ourselves and understand what it means to become kind of inclusive from the ground up. So if we think about like when we first set out on this project, we were thinking very much about learning design practice, like what does inclusive learning design look like, and what does that mean we as learning designers need to do every day. But through understanding more about inclusion in general, and all of the research that we've done, that we think that that's not enough. There's more. So there's the change that we want to see in the world. So this is the kind of the inclusive learning design principles. There's the practices, so like what a toolkit might contain, like how we as learning designers will bring about that change. But absolutely crucially, what about our role in this? What about LearnJam as an organisation? What about our policies? How do we hold ourselves accountable for creating the change that we want to see in the world? And that has been, I think, a really big and positive outcome of this project, is that recognition that this is about so much more than creating a toolkit.
Yeah, we have to walk the walk, right? We've got to kind of be it. Yeah.
And I think it's also about starting, it's a beginning. It's starting new relationships. It's about bringing new voices into a conversation, but also letting that conversation evolve. There's not like an end to it. It's not like, today we'll be really woke and talk to 5 new people, and tomorrow we'll just carry on doing what we're doing. That's not transformative at all. And that's partly what makes it hard work, because it's very engaging on so many levels. This is not just about kind of designing a learning experience. You question so much. It really brings in personal identity. And I think coming back to the very nature of inclusion and diversity and being fair, the experience of feeling left out is a very personal experience. It is about personal identity. It's, what is it about me that is not okay for this environment or experience? Why don't I get to be part of it? So the whole thing becomes much more than a sort of professional project with a goal and a time frame and so on. And I think just seeing it that way, seeing it as a beginning of a transformative process, to use your word, Laurie, I think is quite important to recognize it as transformation. It's a lot bigger than we ever could have imagined from the beginning. So, yeah. And I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I think we had a sense of that, but maybe to some extent it's like initially it just felt like this will be a really interesting project and a really interesting thing to explore, and hopefully we'll create something really good and useful and impactful as a result of it. But yeah, I think we didn't really realize when we jumped into this what it would mean for us as an organisation and the direction it would take us in, which is pretty cool.
Very cool, yeah. And I mean, I'll only speak for myself here. I don't want to put words in anyone's mouth, but I think even that there's like a privilege of surprise. Like how fortunate of me to feel like actually I can't just come up with a good idea and fix things. How lucky, it's. You hear this phrase about sort of, checking your privilege, but I think there's a lot to be said for this kind of conversation in reminding people, and again, I'll only speak for myself here, but I have had access to so many things in my life, and this is what contributes to systems that are unfair, is where entire groups of people who were accustomed to having access forget that that's a special thing and forget that not everybody does, and it's easy to overlook. But obviously, because there's so much happening in the world and we all have to filter our attention somehow and, not be overwhelmed. But those filters can be dangerous because they cause you to miss things that are just not part of your daily experience. And that's quite a privileged position to be in, to be able to wake up one day and say, what a surprise, that there's so much I don't know about exclusion.
So I think we've talked really nicely just there around like the impact on us, like how there are kind of consequences and implications for this project.
We haven't really talked about what's next. That was your last question.
This looking ahead thing. Yeah, what happens now?
Lucy and I just came off a call about that. I don't know if we're in a position to say succinctly what's next.
Fresh in your mind. The conclusion of that call was, this is really complicated. We're not sure. Yes.
So, it shouldn't be a surprise to hear that we've learned a lot through this process. Let's hear some more about that.
So over the course of your research and the conversations that you've had in this project, what have been some of the most sort of eye-opening, thought-provoking things that you've discovered or encountered that really shaped your thinking around the direction of this project?
I think one of the really important things that we've learnt is that there are so many words and terms in this space. So are we talking about EDI or DEI or equality or equity? And I think probably at an intellectual level, we understand what those terms mean, but actually really understanding what they mean with respect to people's lives has been a really important learning for us. So, for an example, equality versus equity, and what do they mean, and which one of those is the thing that we're building into our inclusive learning design, or what mindset are we adopting? So equality is welcoming everyone regardless of their background, so the idea that everyone's equal. And then equity is understanding that people have different starting points, so welcoming everyone informed by their backgrounds and identities. And I think that's a really important distinction. And I think a lot of learner-centred thinking falls into the equality category, whereas I think we want to kind of recognise that it needs to be about equity and recognising people as individuals and recognising their unique lived experiences. And embracing difference rather than saying that difference doesn't matter.
That's a really interesting one. I agree. That was very powerful when we were talking about that the other day. That distinction, how did you just put it? Not, welcoming regardless of people's background, but informed by their background. Yeah, that one struck me. And another insight that came up in one of our conversations the other day was that even in the sphere of inequity and marginalized groups and a kind of awareness of exclusion, there's a kind of hierarchy in the discourse. Like there are conversations that are begun around equality, inclusivity, diversity, which almost always start with gender and race, or one or the other. Those are like the two top positions in the charts of what people discuss when they talk about inclusion and equality and diversity. And yet there are so many ways in which people can be excluded, which is not to say that race and gender are not important issues, but things like physical disability, mental disability, or invisible disabilities, age. There are certain, let's say, categories that are enshrined in law as protected characteristics. And even that list is arguably incomplete. It doesn't include class, for example. So when we talk about issues of inclusion and diversity, it's especially because these conversations are often uncomfortable. I think it's often tempting to start with certain topics that we've, let's say, become more comfortable addressing. Even that is kind of exclusive in an approach, because you end up with this like hierarchy of marginalization. Like these are the most important things to talk about. Well, they're not more important than others. If someone's excluded, they're excluded. We need to dig into the reasons why. So that struck me as interesting, because it was one of those things that when you hear it said to you, you realize the truth of it. You realize, gosh, yeah, race and gender, those two issues are always coming up. What about all these other ways in which people can be excluded? So yeah, I think just keeping an open mind and being prepared to redefine our terms, whether it's equality and equity or recognizing, different characteristics that can lead to barriers, which can lead to exclusion. Yeah, those have been some eye-openers lately.
Some real humdingers there.
Oh, there's so many. There's so many. We'll do another episode just on the humdingers.
I got one more question, actually. This comes off the back of a conversation we had, I think, last week or the week before. Let's say I'm running a business which is involved in developing and selling online courses. As a little thought exercise.
You are.
What do you mean, let's say?
No, yeah. Helps other people develop and sell online courses. But yeah. But let's say that's if that's my role. Why should I care about this?
That is a very good question. I'm sure you're not the first to think it and ask it. I feel like there are so many possible answers to that question. And I think the moral case alone is strong enough to justify caring about including people. Yep. We are all people. We all have certain rights to learning and participation in society and full participation in society. And I feel like there is an ethical responsibility to dismantle barriers to that. If you're running a business, I mean, the numbers are staggering. It's incredible when you start looking at who is potentially excluded from this or that, and you realize that, for example, there's Global Accessibility Awareness Day is around now, and I was looking on their website the other day, and they point out that an estimate of the number of people in the world who have a disability, whether it's visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive, is 1 billion.
1.85 billion.
Did you find 1.8 billion? See, this is the thing. You're talking about just unfathomable numbers of people who were potentially excluded.
A quarter of the world's population. Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty good reason to care, isn't it?
I think it's
even from a completely cold-hearted, hard-headed business point of view.
Well, I think this is again I can only talk for myself, but I think in most things it's important to be pragmatic and realistic and. Yeah. All of us in the world have limited resources and capacity of time, energy, money, lifespan. We do at some point have to make choices about where we invest our attention and our time. Yeah. And I think, as I said, while ethically we have a responsibility as members of a global community to ensure everybody can participate fully in our community activities, which include learning, there's also just the hard, sheer numbers of the fact that if we're potentially excluding a quarter of the world's population, that's really not, that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, and there are opportunities there for businesses, but I think just as humans, that's the most important thing. And plus, we're all going to be excluded at one point or another. I don't think you'd ever find someone who says, no, I've never been left out. I'm part of everything. And if they do, they're very fortunate. But even just through the process of aging, we pass through certain communities and communities of practice and discourse communities that we can participate in more or less. So why design things that we're designing ourselves out of? Because we'll all be in that position. It's very relatable. It's just that we have to stop sometimes and relate. Actually think about it.
Yeah.
Even if we don't consider ourselves excluded right now, it's likely that at some point in our lives we will be in that position. We actually probably are in some ways without even being consciously aware of it.
Well, this is the thing, we might not care sometimes. I don't care about being excluded from the roller derby community because I don't care to participate in roller derby. But there are always going to be moments where you really want to participate in something and it is just inherently unfair that you can't because of some characteristic or status that's outside your control.
Maybe to summarize, that if you think about this, if you think about inclusive learning design becoming more inclusive, you will be supporting more learners, which can only be a good thing, reaching more learners, improving learner results because you are addressing the needs and preferences of the learners you serve rather than your own. And this thinking from a kind of society point of view, this helps to create richer learning experiences for all learners. So like better learning for all, and it helps learners better participate in society. So kind of better society for all. So that's the kind of like moral case.
Yeah.
But even thinking beyond that, greater diversity and building that thinking and that mindset into the work you do leads to greater innovation. There's lots of research that's been done into that. So, if you want to become more innovative as an organisation, then care about inclusion and inclusive practices.
Absolutely, yeah.
Lots of reasons.
I'm glad you mentioned that one. I always forget to think of that, but that sort of, if you consider innovation and creativity to come about from looking at things from a new point of view, and then you bring a bunch of people into your thinking team who bring different points of view, by definition, you're going to come up with new ways of looking at problems. And that is generally a very good thing. Yeah.
I think we can all agree on that. So just to sum that up, so why should we care? Well, you'll reach more people, you'll be more innovative, and you'll make the world a better place.
Not bad reasons, eh?
It's all right, isn't it?
That's all right, isn't it? Feels worthwhile.
Worth getting out of bed and, walking to your home desk or whatever for...
Yes. Yeah. We finished by talking about the principle of designing for one and extending to many.
When we were talking about the numbers of people with disabilities, for example, I think it's important to remember that whatever numbers you put on those things, they're either estimates or they only reflect the known population. There are plenty of people in plenty of countries and cultures who, for whatever reason, have not explicitly, recognized or diagnosed a particular need. That doesn't mean they don't have it. So if you are designing to be more inclusive and take into account the needs of, let's say, a learner who uses a wheelchair or is from a particular ethnic background or is of a particular age or needs particular tools to access a course, for example, you won't just catch the learners who know they have those needs. You'll also catch the learners who haven't yet formally been told or realized they have those needs. So there might be people around the world who are struggling to understand something in a course and they don't know why they're struggling. And it may be that they, pull an example out of thin air, maybe they have dyslexia and they're struggling to process certain written and spoken text, but they don't know that. They've never taken a test. They're not aware. Whereas if you've designed your course in a way to be accessible to people who do know they have certain support needs, then you also catch all the people who have those needs and just don't know or can't say it. Yeah. And I think that's another good reason that there's the principle Lucy and I have talked about a lot on this project of designing for one and extending to many. So you design for the needs of one learner or one group, and actually that catches many others.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, Laura, moving beyond the numbers, so regardless of the numbers, as you said, this is about recognizing that all participation is worthy. So let's forget about the numbers for a second. And if we think that all participation is worthy, then we have that mindset where we are moving towards more inclusive design.
We'd love to hear your thoughts on inclusive learning design or any questions you've got. Please do just drop us a line on hello@learnjam.com and we'll get back to you. Adventures in Learning Design was brought to you by LearnJam.
To learn more about what we do and who we do it for, and to download your own free copy of our learning design principles, head over to LearnJam.com.